thankful for the opportunity. That was really nice. Well, allow me to be a fanboy for just a moment. As a former Chris Dodd intern in the United States Senate, getting to listen to the leader, getting to listen to one of my political heroes say that about you is just a real wonder to me. And I want to thank all of the people who made tonight possible. And in particular, I want to thank Secretary Albright for inviting me, but also for making this courageous decision to take a few of us who came to the Senate with an eye to try to be helpful and relevant on the matter of how America charts its course in a brave new world under her wing. It was very early in my term as a new member of the Foreign Relations Committee where I got the chance to sit in a nearby office with the secretary and a few other smart people. She's been so wonderful to invite me to her home, to give me counsel, and to give me the opportunity to liaison with a group of leaders and thinkers that really has no rival in this room. And so I'm so grateful for the help that she's given me in terms of my learning curve. To Ken Wallach, thank you for all of your fantastic work leading NDI, and to Jerry Hartz for being somebody that I learned a lot from when he was mentoring new young members of the House of Representatives to the work that he now does, ensuring that Congress is supporting the vital work of this organization. I don't want to keep you very long here. This will be a relatively merciful keynote speech because you've heard everything you need to hear from these inspirational awardees. But I do want to make a little bit of this broader case that Senator Daschle previewed about the challenges that we face as a nation and how badly misresourced we are today. You know, when the United States faces a really serious national security challenge that requires a military response, we meet that challenge. We meet it uniformly, we meet it professionally, we meet it mostly without regard to resources or costs. And I will just bring you back to the spring of this year to make that case more acutely. In response to the use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad in Syria, within 1 week, a major military attack by the United States was conceived, planned, and executed with deadly precision. It was, quite frankly, America at its most impressive. No military in the world has more capability than ours. When the U.S. military is given a task, the resources are never a question. Capacity is never in doubt. Time is but a minor obstacle. And so nobody was surprised that night in April when word came down that that attack went as planned, virtually perfectly. And the next morning, no one was surprised when the attack did virtually nothing to change the reality of the dystopia-creating civil war that's killed 400,000 in Syria. No one was surprised that a political solution still seemed a billion miles away. Nobody was surprised that no matter how badly damaged that airfield was, Syria was still, frankly, just as big a national security nightmare for the United States and our allies. Our military can meet any challenge that's presented to us, but increasingly, for as much focus is rightly placed on the kinetic threats from extremist groups in the Middle East or a potentially nuclear-armed North Korea or Iran, it's the non-military challenges to the world order that mount by the day. And as we saw this week, listen, attackers still want to hit us, but the major offensive actions that have been mounted against this country in the last decade have largely come through the militarization of information and the ability to do damage to us and our allies through technology. So a strong military is still vital to guard against conventional security threats, but the emerging threats to global stability exert influence that cannot be checked by military power alone. Tonight, you are rightly focused on the damage that can be done to political and economic stability by the dissemination of propaganda and disinformation. And it is frankly a perfect lens through which to view how poorly positioned America is today to fight these new non-kinetic threats. China's public diplomacy budget is reported to be $10 billion annually. NATO's Stratcom Center, who I visited with 2 weeks ago in the Baltics, suggests that today Russia is spending over $1 billion just on covert propaganda operations. And so maybe it shouldn't be surprising that America and our allies are so vulnerable to the effects of disinformation when our budget for public diplomacy is $650 million, a fraction of what our adversaries are spending. So if a shooting war breaks out, we're going to be ready. But the consequences of spending 20 times as much money on military and intelligence programs as we do on State Department and USAID programs, the effect of having more people working at military grocery stores than we have diplomats deployed abroad, it is starting to catch up with us. And so let's apply this to a current crisis. And you've heard about it already today. One of your awardees can speak to it better than I can. I'm just back from a short trip to the Baltics, but also to Ukraine. It's my fourth and the first since I went 3 times in 2013, 2014 with John McCain. I missed him 2 weeks ago, but the scene that I witnessed, frankly, wasn't really unfamiliar. The billions we are spending on building up U.S. and NATO's military presence in Europe, it is undoubtedly having a positive effect. Russia is getting the message about what would come to them if they tried to cross a NATO line. And the millions that we're spending on training up the Ukrainian troops that I was able to visit, it's working too. They're getting better and stronger on the line. But let's be honest, Vladimir Putin doesn't want to march his army into Kyiv or Lviv. He wants to politically and economically break Ukraine so that it loses its will to fight and it submits to his will. And so he is spending much more time and energy using non-military means to undermine Ukraine than he is spending trying to move that line in eastern Ukraine. In particular, Putin is focused on winning the information war in Ukraine, and he is focused on it every single day. But we continue to have a conversation in this country about support for Ukraine largely through that military lens. We are pumping large amount of money into military spending in Ukraine and Estonia and Poland, and it's worthwhile. But meantime, Russian TV and radio and internet bots continue to spread misinformation about Russia, about the United States, and about our intentions with almost no pushback from the United States and our allies. Or how about the Balkans? In order to fund the small amount of non-military programming that we now do in Ukraine, the State Department initially had to shift money away from this region. And over the last year, as many of you know, as the Secretary certainly knows, the Russians, who abhor a vacuum, have filled that void. They're putting huge resources into buying up media outlets and buying influence. In Serbia today, which in many ways is the fulcrum point of the Balkan region, the Serbs have a far higher opinion of Russia than they do of the United States. Now, I get it. Some of that is certainly understandable given the history of Russian military support in Serbia and the legacy of the NATO bombing campaign. But you can't escape the fact that today, Russia is all over this region, a region which is literally deciding, as we speak, whether to orient itself around Russia's periphery or whether to join up with transatlantic institutions. When I was there a few years ago in Belgrade, I saw all over the streets billboards plastered up and down the avenues depicting interwoven Serbian and Russian flags with a small little Gazprom logo down in the lower left-hand corner. In a region where, quite frankly, global conflicts start, that is still a minor ethnic and nationalist powder keg, Russia is buying influence with information. And we are not on the scene in the way that we could be. So the world has changed. The tools that our rivals and our enemies use have transformed. And we've largely stayed the same. We paid lip service to standing up these new capacities, but so far, it's been largely that. Now, with your help, as Senator Daschle mentioned, this is starting to change. I'll mention it again, but Senator Portman and I have worked diligently for the last 2 years to beef up our government's capacity to fight these asymmetric battles. We wrote legislation to permanently establish inside the State Department this entity called the Global Engagement Center. Now, it had existed already, but it was largely focused only on anti-extremist messaging, and it was funded at a meager $5 million a year. Now, we were successful in writing this center into the Defense Authorization Bill, giving the authority for the Defense Department to transfer up to $80 million into that center. And after some initial hesitancy, the administration came around to the wisdom of this new capacity and agreed to move forward with its authority. And found the means to move $60 million, which still is an 8-fold increase over the amount of money that the Global Engagement Center previously had at its disposal. Now listen, it's $60 million. It is not the $10 billion that China has. It is not the $1 billion in covert money that Russia has, but it is an important signal that we are not going to stand down, that we are going to develop capacities to push back. And that signal alone is worthwhile, because what you may be trying to achieve ultimately is not just a tit for tat, but a detente in which the other side understands what capacities you have and starts to think twice about the capacities that it's willing to use. And our idea here is not to pay for an American message to be spread abroad. What we want to do is support domestic journalists to be able to tell the story that they want, rooted in their priorities and their vision, rather than in the priorities and visions of outsiders like the Russians, who pay for spin and slant and bias. And we can't and we shouldn't play the same game that the other side does, but that doesn't mean that we should just sit on the sidelines, because it's hard to figure out how we engage when the other side is playing so unfairly. We can, and I think the Global Engagement Center gets this right, we can engage on terms that alter our adversaries' calculations, but hold to our values. And so some of you have heard me make this broader case before for non-kinetic capabilities, and I hope you do check out this plan that I wrote, that I've tried to send far and wide to my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, calling for a doubling of our non-military foreign affairs budget over the next 5 years to meet these new challenges to U.S. security that have emerged around the world. And the idea is pretty simple. If President Trump can breezily call for a $50 billion expansion of the Department of Defense budget, why should we be sheepish about calling for it to be matched, at the very least, by a similar expansion of the capabilities that meet the myriad of threats all around the world, whether it be disinformation and propaganda or petro-rich energy dictators that have no clear military answer. But at the very least, on the heels of the information attacks against the United States that, well, may have tipped the balance of the presidential election, if we can't ultimately achieve this larger rebalance of our kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities, then we should at least start arming ourselves to fight with the Chinese and the Russians and the extremist groups in the space that they are fighting, and that is in the information space. So that's why you're here tonight, to honor the work of individuals and organizations who are really pioneering the way to fight back, to make sure that truth is heard all around the world. Margot and the team at Stop Fake work every day in and out to refute the avalanche of false and misleading stories about Ukraine. And they're training people inside Ukraine and in other countries to do the same. The Oxford Internet Institute is doing pioneering work on how Russia and others use bots and social media platforms to manipulate public opinion. And Maria's organization, Rappler, it's a social network site that shares news stories while exposing the organized effort to weaponize the internet against the government's opponents. It's great to know that we have so many partners around the world who are teaching us how to do this work. The question now is, will the United States Congress recognize that we are not helpless, that the end of our engagement on this question doesn't have to be investigations as to what happened before, that we can learn from what the groups that you are honoring here tonight do and maybe help fund them grow and expand their work. It is great to know that we have so many partners in this room who are doing incredibly important work in the service of democracy. But if policymakers don't join the efforts of these brave groups, we may lose this information war without even starting to fight it. Thank you very much for having me tonight.